Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston for the week ending Friday, July 4th, 2025. Happy Independence Day, everyone. We have got a ton of good stuff coming up this week, including a look at a guilty plea from someone convicted or who would have been convicted of body mismanagement. We have also a little discussion about the growing legalization of human composting and a look at the new NFDA leadership. Plus, I don't know if you saw this on social media, but in Ghana, they have these really kind of in-depth funerals that were not only revealed by, but preserved by an anthropologist. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And I guess coincidentally, there was a story about a Ghanaian funeral director, and I just thought it was a heavy week for Ghana in funeral news, so I figured I'd throw that in as well, and lots of other nicks and knacks, and we will get to all of that after this word from our friends and sponsors at Homesteaders Life.
In a business built on trust, consistent financial strength speaks volumes. That's why I'm proud to share that AM Best has once again affirmed Homesteaders' financial strength with an A- excellent rating. Last year was a transformative one for our company, and AM Best affirmation tells us we're on the right track. As a mutual company, owned by our policy owners, we remain laser focused on delivering dependable value, industry-leading support, and future-ready solutions to funeral professionals nationwide. Homesteaders is stronger than ever by every measure. Our partners rely on us for the long term, and it is critical that we execute at a high level today while aggressively planning for the future. Reach out to your Homesteaders account executive to hear more about how we are leading the profession in investing in tools and services that benefit funeral providers.
Okay, so before we get into it this week, I do want to talk a little bit about what's coming up in Funeral Service Insider, the newsletter, which you can subscribe to by following the link in the show notes. In this week, we speak with two of the people behind the College of Southern Nevada's new mortuary school program. It is the first in the state, I guess the only in the state. And it's interesting, I mentioned it in the story, but this is a state where you have to kind of apprentice your way into your license. There are ways to get licensed, and one of them is you have to pass the Nevada test, but there is no schooling for it. And the idea of not only instilling professionalism, but making it a little bit easier for people who weren't, second, third generation funeral directors to get into the funeral industry is a big part of it. So this is a really kind of exciting time. They don't have a bunch of students yet, but it's a growing program, and there's some really dedicated people behind it. So if you're not a subscriber, like I said, this is a great time to subscribe. And of course, you can read 3 stories, I think, per 90 days with just your email address if you want to take a look at the story and see. I try to make Funeral Service Insider worth it every week, and this is one of the weeks where I think I did a good job. So if you have the means, it's probably worth subscribing. But let's get into the stories for this week for now. So Lance Pack, the former owner of Downard Funeral Home in Pocatello, Idaho, has officially pled guilty this week as part of a plea agreement. There are a ton of things that he was accused of doing. They include felony level tax evasion, perjury, grand theft by deception, fraud. There's a ton of stuff. Essentially, he just stopped living up to his responsibilities, and horrible things happen. There's a link to it in the show notes, and it's a series of stories that's been going on for a couple of years. That's not really what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was what he said when he was making his apology, and I mean apology in sense of an excuse, explanation to the court. And while he didn't provide any excuses like it wasn't my fault kind of thing, he mentioned that he's been having mental health issues and things kind of spun out of control for him. And that's something that we've seen before. I reported maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit more, about a funeral director in, I feel like it was in Pennsylvania, who was just old and was too old to do the job, but didn't have anything that he could do. And eventually, he lost his license, and it was, I think, for one body. And I mean, I guess one body is horrible as more than one body, but at least it didn't go on and on and on. At the heart of it, though, and this is something that I said back then and I'll say again, is this kind of denial that your life is spinning out of control. And, we know that funeral directors can suffer from depression and can struggle to ask for help for the depression. But if you think of it in terms of this guy who ruined his entire reputation and his entire career and multiple families' memories of their loved ones, you have a responsibility when you are running out of gas to say that you're running out of gas. It's a silly thing to bet everything you've done for your whole life that you can dig yourself out of anxiety and depression without a little bit of help. So just keep that in mind if you are struggling, or if you see a friend who's struggling, mention to them that there are solutions, and it's okay to say that I am drowning and there's no way out. I mean, even if you've committed just a little bit of fraud, it's better than body mishandling, which not only makes everyone look bad, but it's a crime against yourself and what you purport to stand for. So there's a link to the story in the show notes and to some of the other things that I've covered along this line. And I guess right now is the best time to mention that I was actually honored to be asked to speak to the upcoming peer-to-peer event sponsored by the Cremation Association of North America, and that's going to be on July 15th. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. That is for funeral directors. I know we have non-funeral directors who listen. This is a funeral director event. But we're going to be talking about the ethics of trying too hard and how you decide what families you help and what families you overhelp and how you feel about those things. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well, and I'm looking forward to that. I don't know if it's overdoing this to call it an historic election, but the NFDA recently announced its newly elected leadership for the 2025-26 term. Daniel Ford, who was the president-elect, will be the president following the convention this year in October. Chris Christian of Rogersville, Tennessee, will be the president-elect, and Stephen Spahn from Dickinson, Tennessee, will take on the role of treasurer. In the only contested election this year, Ellen Wynn McBrayer of Villa Rica, Georgia, was elected secretary, securing 61% of the vote over Homer Elwood Jr. of South Carolina. And I spoke with three of the people who were elected before the election as kind of like a preview story. And Ellen was one of them, and she was, unbelievably gracious, but we didn't want to make a huge deal out of it at the time. But it's worth noting that if things go as they've gone in the past, she will eventually rise to become the first woman president of the NFDA, which is fantastic. I mean, it's 2025, but what are you going to do about that? It's fantastic that she has been elected, and I really hope that she's able to and willing to stay with it and eventually assume the presidency. And finally, Carlos Black of Mobile, Alabama, and Christopher Costello of New Orleans, Louisiana, were elected as the at-large representatives. There's a link to the press release in the show notes if you want to check it out, and also to Ellen's interview, as well as the other two interviews I did. It was Steve Spahn and Carlos Black also spoke with me about their hopes for the upcoming year, and those stories will be available too. It is July 3rd as I record this, and whenever you listen to it, what's interesting is that July 1st has come and gone, and with it, the official legalization of terramation in Georgia and Minnesota. And we have a feature coming up with Micah Truman of Return Home, who is planning on opening a facility in Minnesota. They made their official announcement about that, I guess, on July 1st, or there was a flurry of announcements about it in the consumer press on July 1st. But that was something that we talked about on the podcast, and we'll dig a little deeper into in either August or September. American Cemetery and Cremation magazine, as well as here in Funeral Service Insider's newsletter. New Jersey also got one step closer, passing it in the legislature and sending it to the governor's desk. On the face of this looks like, a huge shift toward terramation. And again, I don't want to go that far. I know that there is a long way to go before this is a more common form of disposition. But as I think I mentioned last week, it is certainly a more legitimate form of disposition than people thought it was, really even just 3 years ago when I first got started covering the space. The success of terramation is going to rely, though, on independent funeral directors who are able to and willing to send their families, to offer this to their families as a kind of partnership with any of the companies that are providing that service right now. So, as Micah said in the podcast, it is a huge ask for funeral directors to just throw this on top of the other service they provide. And what he recommended was going and taking a tour of any of these facilities. I mean, he'd love it if you took a tour of his, but he's also a true believer. So there's Earth Funeral and there is Recompose, and there are others that are starting to kind of come into play. So if it is something that you think your families might want, you, I think, will find any of these companies very receptive to your questions and to your partnership. And there's a link to this flurry of stories in the show notes, but it was really just an opportunity to once again remind funeral directors and, whomever's listening. We have a lot of different listeners, I've come to understand, that this is a form of disposition that is not going to go away. And as it becomes more popular, you could do worse than not only understanding it, but having a partner ready if one of your families asks about it. So link in the show notes, and I'll put a link to the podcast that we did with Micah. It was just 2 weeks ago as I record this now, so it may still be fresh in your head. But if you're a new listener, and welcome to all of our new listeners, there's something else for you to listen to over this glorious holiday weekend. So this is a story that gets a little more convoluted every time I take a look at it. And we reported on it back in February. It was Shepherd Memorial Park in Hendersonville, North Carolina, was supposed to be sold at auction. Melody Shepherd, the widow of the former owner, was not only prevented from bidding on it, but she also was prevented from being on the property. Such has been the difficulties at that cemetery. And so when they had the eventual auction, the judge had set a floor of $900,000 for the property. The cemetery owed $916,000 in debt, and an independent auditor said that it should bring between $900,000 and $1.4 million, which is why the judge set that floor, but nobody bid. And here's why. The cemetery had an awful reputation, and just the reputational blowback alone made it very difficult for anyone to take a chance on a tainted cemetery. One of the people who showed up to bid but elected not to bid was Jimmy Altmeyer, who is a funeral home owner of some renown in the area, and a name that may be familiar to many of you listening. What I said at the time was that if it was even close to reasonable, one thinks he probably would have pulled the trigger on it or attempted to pull the trigger on it. But I think everybody showed up expecting more of a bargain basement kind of sale because of the extensive local press of the funeral home and cemetery combination. And it is worth mentioning here, especially in light of what we discussed at the beginning of the show, that Thomas Shepherd, Melody's former husband, deceased, died of severe depression. And in an earlier story, he talked about how he had kind of been saddled with the business by his father, and couldn't really find a way out of it. So that brings you up to date on what had been going on until this most recent week. This week, Mrs. Shepard appeared in court and asked if she could open a trust and allow the trust to bid on the cemetery. There's a link to the story in the show notes. She said that she felt maligned by the coverage of all of the tragedies that have befallen her family and really thinks that the cemetery is worth saving as it is. She said she felt that she could put together a trust for about $340,000 to bid on the cemetery. The highest bid so far, now that the first bid failed, is by Jimmy Altmeyer, who has bid, or who is willing to bid, about $250,000 on the cemetery. There's a link to the story from the Henderson Lightning newspaper in the show notes, and it does a really good recap in the beginning. And of course, I'll link to all of my stories that kind of covered it from the perspective of the funeral industry. Although it is doubtful that she will succeed, the judge is giving her a couple of days to put her bid together. And actually, probably by the time you hear this, there will be a resolution. And when there is, I will report on it here on In Case You Missed It, and I will provide links to all of those things in the show notes. And finally, in Ghana funeral news, I've linked in the show notes to a long feature about Swiss anthropologist Regula Tschumi, I think we're going to pronounce it. It is Tschumi. And she had done a PhD work on funerary artistry in Ghana and in the surrounding area. And what made her work so important was that during colonial times, a lot of the rites and rituals were banned and lost. And while the people were able to put a lot of them back together as they reignited their funeral practices, there were some things that were lost that she had discovered and shared with them. So that is reason number one to click and read this fascinating story. Reason number two is you really ought to see these caskets. They are handmade and they are kind of a combination obituary casket. So whatever was important about the person's life or whatever the person thought was important about their life, that is what the casket is made into. So there are pineapples. There is one of a whale shark. They're absolutely beautiful and certainly worth taking a look at. One note in the story that is worth sharing as well is that while the casket makers in Ghana are always, are grateful for the work that they get in their own country, their real money comes from selling these fantastic caskets overseas, where they sell them to museums and they sell them to art galleries. It didn't mention that they sell them to people abroad, but this is, again, the kind of thing that if I were going to have a casket handmade, I would definitely have it handmade in Ghana, I guess is the best way to put it. So there's a link to that in the show notes, and it's worth checking out. I mentioned there were two. The other one is one of the stories that is common all over the world. It's about how young women are stepping up to take their place in funeral service. This one is about a young woman named Winifred Iwurabena Kwarteng. And again, a link to the show notes. I hope I didn't butcher this poor person's name that much. Is one of the youngest female morticians and hearse drivers in the country. She has taken over her late father's funeral business at 22, and now at 24, she runs 2 funeral service branches in the central region of Ghana. And she views her work as important and is talking about how, even though she faces probably more discrimination than, let's say, a U.S. woman, she is overcoming it by just working hard and being good. What do they say about Ginger Rogers, backwards and in heels? So there's a link to that story as well. And she hopes to reshape how people think of women in funeral service in Ghana. And she's doing her level best to make that happen. And that will do it for this week. Before I let you go, though, I want to let you know there will be no Funeral Service Insider newsletter on July 17th, and there will be no In Case You Missed It podcast on July 11th, but everything is back to normal again. So you will hear from me again on July 18th on the next episode of In Case You Missed It. In the meanwhile, we do have a podcast coming up that features Mel Bennett, the founder of Life Forest, which is such an interesting company. I had no idea what they really did until I spoke with her, and it's great. It's a great episode. It's long. I usually keep them to about half an hour. This is a little bit closer to 40 minutes, but I guarantee you it is worth it. She's a really fascinating person with a really great story, and I'm looking forward for you to hear it. In Case You Missed It is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. Please subscribe wherever you're listening now. If you have any feedback that you would like to leave, you can either do it by clicking the link in the show notes to send me an email, or you can call and leave a message. My phone number is 732-746-0233, extension 709. That is 732-746-0233, extension 709, and I will catch you next time. Have a great holiday weekend.